Welcome, Night Owl. I'm glad you've joined me for tonight's relaxing journey through history. Tonight, we're going to explore the lives of some of medieval history's most terrible kings, rulers whose reigns were marked by cruelty, madness, or decisions so catastrophic they changed the course of nations. As we settle in, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. And if you enjoy this calm style of historical storytelling, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Tonight's journey takes us through the courts and castles of medieval Europe, where power was absolute but often wielded by hands that trembled with madness or clenched with cruelty. We'll meet kings who started with promise but descended into darkness, kings whose minds fractured under the weight of their crowns, and kings whose brutality became the stuff of nightmares. So get comfortable, let your breathing deepen, and let me take you back in time to when kings could be monsters and no one could stop them. Our first stop is 14th century France, where we meet a king whose reign began with such hope but ended in tragedy. Charles VI of France was just 11 years old when he became king in 1380. The people loved him immediately. They called him Charles the Beloved. Young, handsome, and full of energy, he seemed like the answer to France's prayers. The early years of his reign were filled with grand festivals, tournaments, and celebrations. The future looked bright. But on a cold January night in 1393, everything changed. The king was attending a masquerade ball at the royal palace. He and 5 other men dressed up as wild men, wearing costumes made of linen soaked in wax with flax attached to look like fur. It was meant to be entertaining, a bit of fun for the court. But someone made a terrible mistake. The king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, brought a torch too close to the dancers. The costumes caught fire instantly. The room filled with screams. Men ran in all directions, their bodies engulfed in flames. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. 4 of the men died in agony over the following days. Charles survived only because the Duchess of Berry threw her heavy robe over him, smothering the flames before they could consume him. But while his body escaped the fire, his mind did not. The ball of the burning men, as it came to be called, left scars that never healed. In the months after the fire, Charles began to change. He would rush through the palace halls at night, howling like a wolf. He insisted he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. Servants had to walk carefully around him, speak softly, move slowly. One wrong move and the king would scream, convinced he was breaking into pieces. He forgot his own name. He didn't recognize his wife or children. For months, he refused to bathe or change his clothes. His hair grew long and matted. His robes became tattered and filthy. When lucid moments came, Charles was gentle and sad, deeply distressed by what was happening to him. He would weep and ask forgiveness. But these moments of clarity grew rarer as the months turned into years. His madness created a crisis for France. Without a functioning king, nobles fought for control. The country fractured. England saw weakness and renewed the 100 Years' War, invading French territory and winning major battles. Through it all, Charles drifted in and out of reality, sometimes a king, sometimes a madman who didn't know his own name. There's a story that shows the tragedy of his condition. Once, during a brief period of sanity, Charles met an old friend he hadn't seen in years. The knight had come to court hoping to see the king he once served. When Charles saw him, he remembered. For just a moment, the fog lifted. He embraced his old friend and wept, saying how good it was to see him again, how much he had missed him. It was a glimpse of the man Charles could have been. But then the fog returned, and Charles was lost again. By the end of his life, Charles was a shell. The vibrant young man who had been crowned with such hope spent his final years lost in confusion, fear, and delusion. When he died in 1422, he had been mad more than he had been sane. His son had already taken over most of the ruling. France had learned to function without its king. It was a sad end to a reign that had promised so much. Charles the Beloved became Charles the Mad, and France paid the price. Your breathing slows naturally now as you think about how fragile the human mind can be, how the weight of a crown, combined with trauma, can break even a young and promising king. Charles wasn't cruel. He wasn't evil. He was sick. But in an age when mental illness was seen as possession or divine punishment, there was no help for him, no treatment, no understanding, just fear and whispers and the slow disintegration of a man who never asked to be king. Settling deeper into comfort now, you can appreciate how far we've come in understanding the mind, how we now know that mental illness isn't weakness or punishment, but something that can happen to anyone. Charles VI didn't choose his fate. The fire that night triggered something in him, some fragility that might have stayed dormant if not for that trauma. And once it began, there was no stopping it. Think about the people around him. His wife, Queen Isabeau, watching her husband disappear into madness. His children, growing up with a father who sometimes didn't know they existed. His advisors, trying to run a kingdom while the king screamed about being made of glass. The servants who had to care for him during his worst episodes, feeding him, cleaning him, protecting him from himself. It was tragedy rippling outward, touching everyone. France survived Charles's madness, but barely. The country emerged from his reign weakened, fractured, vulnerable. It would take decades to recover, all because one young king's mind broke, and there was nothing anyone could do to fix it. As you drift deeper towards sleep, let Charles's story remind you that power doesn't protect against suffering, that crowns don't cure illness, that even kings are human, fragile, vulnerable to the same breaks and cracks that can affect any mind. Tonight, you rest in a world that understands these things better, a world where help exists, where mental illness is recognized and treated, where tragedy like Charles's doesn't have to end in decades of suffering. That's progress. That's hope. That's something worth carrying into your dreams. The medieval world was harsh and unforgiving, especially to those whose minds didn't work the way they should. But we've learned, we've grown, we've built something better. As the story of Charles the Mad fades into the darkness, your muscles relax completely, your breathing becomes slow and steady. You're safe here, far from the burning costumes and shattered minds of 14th century France, far from the confusion and fear that consumed a young king. You can rest knowing that the tragedies of the past have taught us how to build a kinder present. And with that thought, you drift deeper into peaceful sleep. From France, we cross the Channel to England, where another king struggled with mental illness that would tear his kingdom apart. Henry VI of England inherited his throne when he was just 9 months old. too young to understand what kingship meant, too young to hold a scepter, too young for any of it. Regents ruled in his name while ambitious nobles fought for control, each hoping to dominate the infant king and through him the kingdom. Henry grew up gentle and pious, more suited to a monastery than a throne. He loved prayer and learning. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, institutions that still exist today. He was kind, thoughtful, and deeply religious. All admirable qualities in a man, but not necessarily in a medieval king who needed to be strong, decisive, and sometimes ruthless. Henry was none of those things. He was too gentle for the brutal world of 15th century politics. The greatest crisis came in August 1453, when Henry suddenly fell into a mysterious stupor. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't recognize anyone around him. For more than a year, he remained in this vegetative state, unresponsive to everything. Not even the birth of his son and heir could bring him back. He just sat there, empty, gone, like his grandfather, Charles VI. Henry's illness plunged his kingdom into chaos. With no functioning king, old feuds exploded into open warfare. Two branches of the royal family, Lancaster and York, had been circling each other for years, watching, waiting. Henry's collapse was the spark. They went to war, beginning what would be called the Wars of the Roses, named for the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. England descended into civil war, noble against noble, brother against brother, all while their king sat blank and unseeing. When Henry finally emerged from his catatonia in late 1454, he found his kingdom transformed. Battles had been fought, alliances had shifted, power had changed hands. He tried to reassert control, but it was too late. The war had its own momentum now. In 1455, the Yorkists defeated his forces at the Battle of St. Albans. Henry was captured, forced to acknowledge the Duke of York as Lord Protector. His crown remained on his head, but his power was gone. The next 15 years were a nightmare of back and forth. Henry would be king, then a prisoner, then king again, then prisoner again, depending on which side was winning during his periods of madness, which came and went like terrible storms. He had to be cared for like a child, feet washed, dressed. He took no interest in anything, didn't recognize his wife or son, sat staring at nothing for hours. When lucid, he tried to be king, but the damage was done. No one truly trusted him to rule anymore. In 1470, Henry briefly regained his throne with Lancaster's support, but he was a puppet by then. His ambitious wife Margaret and the powerful Earl of Warwick pulled the strings, while Henry drifted between sanity and madness. Less than a year later, the Yorkists struck back. They captured Henry and forced him to give up the throne. The new king, Edward IV, locked Henry in the Tower of London. There, abandoned by his allies and stripped of his crown, Henry's already fragile mind shattered completely. The saddest moment came when messengers brought news that his son had been killed in battle. Henry showed no reaction. He just sat there, lost in whatever dark place his mind had gone. A few days later, on the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry was found dead in his cell. The official story claimed he died of melancholy and grief, but many believed he was murdered, quietly eliminated, because he was more useful dead than alive. Either way, it was a tragic end to a tragic life. Henry VI was perhaps too good to be king, too gentle for a world that demanded strength, too kind for an age of treachery. His mental illness made everything worse. But even without it, he might have struggled. He wanted peace when England needed war. He wanted prayer when politics demanded cunning. He wanted to be a saint when he needed to be a soldier. And England paid for the mismatch between man and crown. Your breathing becomes even deeper now as you think about how cruel fate can be. To be born to power you don't want. To have responsibilities forced on you before you can even walk. To spend your life trying to be something you're not. Failing again and again. Watching your kingdom tear itself apart because you can't be the king it needs. That was Henry's burden. Born to rule but built to pray. Given a sword when he wanted a rosary. Think about his wife Margaret, watching her gentle husband sink into madness while she tried to hold his kingdom together through sheer force of will. Think about his son, growing up knowing his father was king but seeing him powerless. Imprisoned, treated like a prisoner rather than a monarch. Think about the soldiers who died in battles fought because no one could agree who should rule a kingdom whose king had lost his mind. The ripples of tragedy spreading outward, touching thousands. The Wars of the Roses would continue for years after Henry's death. England bleeding itself nearly white. Noble families were destroyed. Thousands died in battles, fought over who had the better claim to a crown. All of it traced back, at least in part, to a gentle king who couldn't hold the realm together because his mind kept slipping away. One man's illness becoming a nation's catastrophe. That's the terrible power and burden of kingship, settling deeper into rest now. You can see how Henry's story mirrors Charles's in some ways. Both were gentle men. Both suffered mental collapses that left them unable to rule. Both watched their kingdoms descend into chaos while they drifted between sanity and madness. But Henry's story is perhaps sadder because he lived longer, suffered more, saw more of the damage his illness caused. Charles died relatively quickly. Henry lingered for years, trapped in a role he couldn't fulfill. There's something particularly tragic about a good man, undone by forces beyond his control. Henry wasn't cruel like some kings we'll meet. He didn't delight in suffering. He wanted peace and learning and faith. He founded schools. He prayed for his enemies. He tried, in his broken way, to be a good king. But wanting isn't enough. Trying isn't enough. Sometimes the burden is too heavy, and the mind buckles under the weight, and good intentions turn to dust while kingdoms burn. As you drift towards sleep, let Henry's story remind you that sometimes there are no villains, just tragedy. Sometimes people fail not because they're bad, but because they're asked to do something impossible. Henry was asked to be strong when he was gentle, to be decisive when he was uncertain, to lead armies when he wanted to lead prayers. And when his mind broke under the pressure, everyone suffered, not because he was evil, but because he was human, and humans break. The medieval world had no understanding of mental illness, no compassion for those whose minds didn't work properly. Kings who went mad were whispered about, feared, sometimes killed quietly to make way for someone more capable. There was no help, no treatment, no hope of recovery, just decline and death and the kingdom moving on without them. That's changed now. We understand more. We can help more. But the tragedy of Henry reminds us how recently that understanding came and how many suffered before it did. Tonight, as you rest in safety and comfort, You can appreciate living in an age that tries to heal broken minds rather than hide them away. An age that sees mental illness as something to treat, not punish. An age where being gentle isn't seen as fatal weakness. Henry VI would have fared better in our world. Maybe his story would have been different. Maybe his kingdom wouldn't have torn itself apart. Maybe he could have lived the quiet, peaceful life his nature craved, instead of being crushed by a crown he never should have worn. From England's gentle madness, we travel north to Scandinavia, where another king's mind would prove his undoing. Erik XIV of Sweden seemed to have everything. He was intelligent, cultured, educated, charming. He spoke multiple languages, wrote poetry, and loved music. When he became king in 1560, Sweden celebrated. He was a Renaissance prince, too brilliant and capable. The future looked bright, but appearances can deceive, and Erik's brilliant mind harbored darkness. From the beginning, there were signs. Erik was prone to sudden mood swings, moments of intense energy followed by deep melancholy. He saw conspiracies everywhere, convinced that enemies surrounded him. His own nobles, his family, even his servants, everyone was suspect. Everyone was plotting. At least, that's what Erik believed. The paranoia grew worse as his reign progressed. What started as suspicion became obsession. What began as caution became terror. Erik's personal life added fuel to the fire. He fell in love with Karin Monstotter, a simple girl who had been a servant in the royal household. By all accounts, she was kind and beautiful, but she was a commoner in the rigid world of 16th century royalty. This was scandal. Erik's advisors begged him to marry a princess, to make a proper alliance. But Erik refused. In 1567, he secretly married Karin and had her crowned queen. The Swedish nobility was outraged. But Erik's most infamous act came that same year, convinced that the Sture family was plotting against him. Erik ordered several noblemen arrested. They were imprisoned in Uppsala Castle, charged with treason. The evidence was thin. The charges were questionable, but Erik was certain of their guilt. He had to stop them before they struck. On a May evening, Erik went to the dungeons to interrogate one of the prisoners, Niels Sture. What happened next would define Erik's reign. According to witnesses, Erik flew into a sudden rage during the interrogation. He grabbed a knife and stabbed Niels Sture himself multiple times in a frenzy. Then he ordered his guards to kill the other imprisoned noblemen. Several men were murdered that night on Erik's command, their bodies disposed of quietly. When word of the Sture murders spread, Sweden was shocked. The king himself had committed murder, not in battle, not in self-defense, but in cold blood, in a dungeon against men who couldn't fight back. The murders turned the nobility against Erik completely. His behavior grew more erratic. He would have fits of rage, then periods of deep depression where he wouldn't leave his chambers for days. He became obsessed with astrology and the occult, convinced he could read the future in the stars. He surrounded himself with fortune tellers and mystics. At times, he seemed to think he was a god, demanding his courtiers worship him. His grip on reality was slipping away. Erik's brothers, John and Charles, saw their opportunity. In 1568, they led a rebellion against him. The Swedish nobility tired of Eric's madness and cruelty, supported the uprising. Eric tried to flee but was captured. His brother John was crowned king, and Eric became a prisoner. The brilliant Renaissance prince, who had ruled just 8 years earlier, was now locked in a cell, his crown gone, his future bleak. But the story doesn't end with his capture. Eric spent the next 9 years imprisoned, moved from castle to castle. His brother John couldn't decide what to do with him. Keep him alive and risk him becoming a symbol for rebels. Kill him and face accusations of murder. So Eric languished in captivity, his mind deteriorating further. He became convinced he wasn't Eric at all, but someone else entirely. He would rant and rave, then fall silent for days. The only constant was Karin, his wife, who stayed with him through it all. Think about that for a moment. Karin could have left. She could have saved herself, returned to the simple life she'd known before becoming queen. But she chose to stay with her mad husband in his prison cells, caring for him, comforting him during his worst moments. In a story full of darkness, Karin's loyalty shines like a small, steady light. She loved him even when his mind was gone, even when he was no longer king, even when staying with him meant sharing his imprisonment. In 1577, after nearly a decade of captivity, Eric died. He was 43 years old. The official cause was illness, but many suspected poison. Perhaps John finally decided his mad brother was too dangerous to keep alive. Or perhaps Eric, in a moment of clarity, chose to end his own suffering. We'll never know. What we do know is that a man who started with such promise died alone in a cell, his brilliant mind destroyed by paranoia and madness. Your muscles relax completely now as you think about wasted potential. Eric could have been a great king. He had the intelligence, the education, the charisma, but his mind betrayed him. The paranoia that might have been manageable became overwhelming. The mood swings that could have been controlled spiraled out of control. And instead of greatness, his reign gave Sweden murder, the house, and eventually his own imprisonment and death. All that potential turned to tragedy, settling into deeper rest. You can see the pattern emerging. Charles VI, Henry VI, Eric XIV. 3 kings whose minds broke under the weight of their crowns. 3 kingdoms thrown into turmoil because their rulers couldn't maintain their sanity. 3 tragic figures, more to be pitied than condemned. They didn't choose madness. They didn't want to fail. But the strain of kingship, combined with whatever fragilities lurked in their minds, proved too much. Think about Eric's tragedy specifically. He murdered men in a fit of rage, then spent 9 years imprisoned for it. Did he understand, in his lucid moment, what he had done? Did he remember the feel of the knife in his hand, the blood, the screams? Or did his fractured mind protect him from those memories, leaving only confusion? We can't know. But either way, it's tragic. Either he remembered and had to live with the horror, or he forgot and lived in confusion. Neither fate is kind. The Stuart murders show how dangerous a mad king could be. Charles VI and Henry VI were dangerous through absence, leaving power vacuums that others filled with violence. But Eric was dangerous through action. His paranoid delusions leading directly to murder. Both kinds of danger were terrible. Both led to suffering. But there's something particularly chilling about a king who kills in a rage and then descends further into madness, never truly answering for what he did. As you drift towards sleep, let Eric's story remind you that intelligence isn't protection against mental illness. That brilliance doesn't make you immune to madness. Eric was smarter than most people in his kingdom, educated beyond almost anyone else. But none of that saved him when his mind began to fracture. The paranoia grew regardless of his intelligence. The rage came despite his education. The madness consumed him even though he could speak 6 languages and write beautiful poetry. Tonight, you rest knowing that we understand mental illness better now. That paranoia can be recognized and treated, that mood swings can be managed, that help exists for minds that start to fracture. Eric lived in an age with no such help. When his mind began to break, there was nothing anyone could do but watch. And when he became dangerous, the only solution was imprisonment. There was no cure, no treatment, no hope, just a cell and declining years and a lonely death. The tragedy of Eric XIV is the tragedy of untreated mental illness in an age that didn't understand it. A brilliant mind destroyed. A promising reign ended in murder. A man who could have been great reduced to a prisoner ranting about conspiracies. All because help didn't exist. Understanding didn't exist. Compassion for the mentally ill didn't exist. Just fear, imprisonment, and an early death for a king whose mind betrayed him. Now we travel east to Russia, where we meet perhaps the most notorious mad king of all, Ivan IV, Tsar of Russia, but known to history by a more chilling name, Ivan the Terrible. His reign would be marked by such cruelty and madness that his name still brings fear more than 400 years after his death. But Ivan's story, like the others, begins in tragedy. Understanding his cruelty requires understanding his childhood. And Ivan's childhood was a nightmare. Born in 1530, Ivan was just 3 years old when his father died. His mother became regent, ruling Russia in his name. But when Ivan was 8, his mother died too, likely poisoned. The young prince was suddenly alone, surrounded by ambitious nobles called boyars who fought each other for power. They paid little attention to the orphaned boy. Ivan and his brother were often neglected, sometimes going hungry. The boyars would mock him, remind him that without their support, he was nothing. They treated the future Tsar like an inconvenience. Imagine being a child in that situation, your parents dead, surrounded by adults who see you as a tool to be used or an obstacle to be overcome, never knowing who to trust, never feeling safe, going to sleep hungry, being mocked by the very people who should protect you. That was Ivan's childhood. It shaped everything that came after. The paranoia, the cruelty, the inability to trust. All of it had roots in those dark early years when a scared child learned that power was the only thing that mattered. At 16, Ivan was crowned Tsar, the first to officially use that title. He was done being powerless, done being mocked, done being the frightened child. The early years of his reign showed promise. He enacted reforms, revised laws, convened Russia's first parliament. He led successful military campaigns, expanding Russia's borders. He was intelligent, capable, and for a time seemed like he might be a great ruler. But the darkness was always there, waiting. In 1560, Ivan's beloved wife, Anastasia, died suddenly. Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned by the boyars, the same nobles who had tormented him as a child. Whether it was true didn't matter. Ivan believed it, and his grief and rage transformed into something terrible. He began to see enemies everywhere. Every setback was a conspiracy. Every failure was betrayal. The paranoia that had simmered since childhood boiled over. Ivan the Capable became Ivan the Terrible. In 1565, Ivan created the Oprichnina, a state within a state under his direct control. At its heart were the Oprichniki, his personal secret police. They dressed all in black, rode black horses, and carried symbols of a dog's head and a broom, representing their role in sniffing out and sweeping away traitors. They answered only to Ivan and operated above all law. They could arrest anyone, torture anyone, kill anyone, all in the Tsar's name. The Oprichniki became instruments of terror. They would descend on towns suspected of disloyalty and massacre the inhabitants. They tortured boyars in creative and horrific ways. They confiscated property, killed families, and spread fear throughout Russia. In 1570, convinced that the city of Novgorod was plotting against him, Ivan ordered its destruction. The Oprichniki swept through the city, killing thousands, men, women, children, nobles and peasants alike. The rivers ran red with blood. It was genocide, pure and simple. But perhaps Ivan's greatest crime was personal. In 1581, during an argument, Ivan struck his pregnant daughter-in-law because he disapproved of her clothing. She miscarried. When his son and heir, also named Ivan, confronted him about this, the Tsar flew into a rage. He struck his son on the head with his iron-tipped staff. The blow was fatal. The young man died days later. Ivan had killed his own son, the heir to Russia, dead by his father's hand in a moment of uncontrollable rage. The aftermath was devastating. Ivan was overwhelmed with grief and guilt. He wept over his son's body. He begged forgiveness. For a moment, the monster became human again, a father mourning the child he had killed. But the damage was done. His capable heir was dead. His remaining sons were unfit to rule. One was disabled. The other, the future Fyodor I, was described as simple-minded. The succession was in crisis, all because Ivan couldn't control his temper. Ivan's final years were marked by physical and mental decline. The decades of stress and violence had taken their toll. He was in constant pain. His behavior grew more erratic. He would pray for hours, then order fresh executions. He seemed half mad, trapped between remorse and rage. In 1584, while playing a game of chess, Ivan suddenly collapsed. He died shortly after, likely from a stroke. Russia's most terrible Tsar was gone, leaving behind a traumatized nation and a shattered legacy. Your breathing becomes slow and steady now as you think about the cycle of violence. Ivan was abused as a child, and he grew up to be an abuser. He was tormented, and he became a tormentor. The boyars taught him that cruelty was how power worked, and he learned that lesson too well. He became what he hated, perhaps even worse. The scared child became the terrifying man, and Russia bled for it. Does understanding his childhood excuse his crimes? No. But it helps explain how a human being becomes a monster, settling deeper into rest. You can see how Ivan's story is different from the others. Charles Henry and Eric were undone by madness. They didn't choose and couldn't control. But Ivan's cruelty felt more deliberate. He chose to create the oprichniki. He chose to massacre in Novgorod. He chose violence again and again. Yes, his mind was damaged by trauma and paranoia. Yes, he clearly suffered from some form of mental illness. But unlike the others, Ivan seemed to embrace his darkness rather than struggle against it. Think about the people who suffered under Ivan's reign. The thousands killed in Novgorod, the boyars tortured to death, the families torn apart by the oprichniki, the son struck down by his own father. Every one of them had lives, dreams, people who loved them, all swept away by a Tsar whose childhood trauma had metastasized into nationwide terror. One man's pain becoming everyone's nightmare. That's the terrible power of an absolute monarch with a broken mind. The most chilling thing about Ivan is how he combined madness with calculation. He wasn't always out of control. Sometimes his cruelty was planned. Deliberate, designed to send a message. The oprichnikis' uniforms, the dog heads and brooms, that was theatre. The destruction of Novgorod, that was strategy, crushing a city that might resist him. Ivan could be coldly rational in his terror, which somehow makes it worse. At least pure madness can be pitied. But calculated cruelty, that's harder to forgive. As you drift towards sleep, let Ivan's story remind you that absolute power in the hands of a damaged person is one of history's greatest dangers. Ivan had no checks on his authority. No one could tell him no. No one could stop him. So his worst impulses became national policy. His paranoia became pogroms. His rage became murder. And Russia paid the price for generations. The time of troubles that followed his death, the chaos and violence, all traced back to the terrible Tsar who trusted no one and killed without mercy. Tonight, you rest in a world where such absolute power is rare, where even kings and presidents face limits, where systems exist to check the worst impulses of leaders. It's not perfect, but it's better than Ivan's Russia, where one man's madness could destroy cities and no one could stop him. The terrible Tsar is long dead, his body dust, his cruelty a memory, but the lesson remains: power without limits, in the hands of a broken mind, is a recipe for horror. Ivan the Terrible died playing chess, an oddly peaceful end for such a violent man. Some say it was fitting that death came during a game of strategy, as if even at the end he was still playing, still calculating. Others say it was mercy, a quick death for someone who had caused so much slow suffering. Either way, his death came as a relief to many. Russia could finally begin to heal. The terrible reign was over. The nightmare could end, or at least change form. From the blood-soaked halls of Ivan's Russia, we turn our attention to other rulers whose reigns were marked by eccentricity, madness, and tragedy. The medieval world was full of kings who struggled with the weight of their crowns, whose minds couldn't bear the pressure, whose personal demons became national nightmares. Let's meet some of these tragic figures, starting with one whose delusion was so strange it still fascinates historians today. Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612, was a man of contradictions. On one hand, he was brilliant. He loved art, science. and learning. His court in Prague became a center of culture and knowledge. He collected rare books, strange artifacts, exotic animals. He employed the greatest astronomers, artists, and thinkers of his age. Tycho Brahe worked under his patronage. Johannes Kepler served in his court. The city of Prague flourished under his rule, becoming one of Europe's most vibrant capitals. But Rudolf had a problem. He believed he was made of glass. This wasn't metaphor or poetry. He genuinely believed his body was glass, fragile and brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. He moved carefully through his palace, terrified of bumping into furniture or walls. He wore thick, padded clothing to protect his delicate glass body. He refused to let people touch him, convinced that physical contact would cause him to break into pieces. Servants were instructed to speak softly in his presence, as if loud voices might create vibrations that could crack him. Think about what it must have been like to be Rudolf, to live in constant fear that the slightest accident would shatter you, to be unable to embrace another person, to shake hands, to feel human warmth without terror, to look at your own body and see not flesh but fragile crystal, the paranoia, the isolation, the loneliness of believing you're too breakable to truly live. It's heartbreaking when you think about it. A brilliant man, trapped in a delusion that made normal life impossible. As Rudolf's glass delusion worsened, his ability to rule declined. He became increasingly reclusive, spending days alone in his chambers surrounded by his collections. He stopped attending meetings. He ignored state business. He became obsessed with alchemy, convinced he could turn lead into gold, find the philosopher's stone, discover the elixir of eternal life. He poured money into these pursuits while his empire slowly fell apart around him. Enemies pressed at the borders. Administration collapsed. But Rudolf was too focused on his crystals and his books to notice or care. His family watched with growing alarm. An emperor who believed he was made of glass couldn't effectively rule. Rivals sensed weakness. In 1611, Rudolf's brother Matthias organized a coup. The Diet, the empire's assembly, stripped Rudolf of most of his power and gave it to Matthias. Rudolf was left as emperor in name only, a fragile glass king in his palace of curiosities. He died the following year in 1612, alone among his treasures, his glass body finally shattering, though it had never really been glass at all, just flesh that believed otherwise. Now let's travel to the Byzantine Empire to meet another emperor whose madness took a different form. Justin II ruled from 565 to 578, and his reign began with promise. He was intelligent, capable, and energetic. He made peace with Persia, stabilizing the eastern frontier. He launched building projects. He seemed like he might be a good emperor. But within a few years, something went terribly wrong with Justin's mind. He began having fits where he would lose all control. He would laugh hysterically for hours, then weep just as long. He would rage at servants for imagined slights. He became convinced that people were plotting against him constantly. But the strangest manifestation of his madness was that Justin believed he couldn't sit down. He became convinced that if he sat, something terrible would happen. So he had a special throne built on wheels that servants would push around the palace while Justin lay on it, never sitting, always prone or standing, but never ever sitting. During his episodes, Justin would bite anyone who came near him. Servants learned to approach him carefully, ready to dodge if he lunged. He once tried to throw himself out of a window. Another time, he attempted to eat one of his own limbs, gnawing at his arm until guards restrained him. The imperial court was in chaos. How do you run an empire when the emperor is biting people and refusing to sit down? The answer is you don't. The empire began to fall apart. Enemies attacked from all sides. The Avars and Slavs invaded from the north and west. The Persians broke the peace and attacked the eastern provinces. Italy descended into chaos as the Lombards invaded. And Justin could do nothing because he was too busy refusing to sit and biting his attendants. His wife, Empress Sophia, a capable and intelligent woman, essentially took over. She made decisions, commanded armies, ran the administration. But she couldn't do it officially because she was a woman in a society that didn't accept female rulers. So she had to work in the shadows while pretending Justin was still in charge. Finally, in 578, Justin died. Some say Sophia had him smothered, unable to bear his madness any longer. Others say he finally sat down, and the shock killed him. Either way, his death was a relief. The empire could finally have a sane ruler again. Sophia tried to hold on to power through the next emperor, but she was eventually sidelined. Still, for years she had kept the Byzantine Empire functioning despite having a mad emperor who bit people and refused to sit. That's impressive in its own strange way. Your muscles relax even more now as you think about how many different forms madness can take. Charles thought he was glass. Henry fell into catatonic states. Eric grew paranoid and murderous. Ivan became cruel and vengeful. Rudolph believed his body was crystal. Justin couldn't sit and bit people, each madness unique, each tragic in its own way. The human mind can break in so many directions, and when it happens to someone with power, the consequences spread far beyond the person suffering, settling deeper into rest. Consider how these mad rulers affected the people around them, the servants who had to care for them, never knowing when the king might turn violent or destructive, the advisors trying to run kingdoms while pretending their king was functional, the wives and children watching their loved ones disappear into delusion, the soldiers dying in wars that might have been prevented if only the king had been sane. The ripples of madness spreading outward, touching thousands, sometimes millions. Think about Sophia dealing with Justin's madness. She had to effectively run the Byzantine Empire while pretending she wasn't because women weren't allowed to rule. She had to make military decisions, diplomatic arrangement, administrative choices, all while maintaining the fiction that her mad husband was in charge. And she had to do it while he was biting servants and refusing to sit down. The absurdity of it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. An empire's survival depending on a woman's secret competence while her husband lost his mind. Now let's meet our final terrible king for tonight. Though his story is less about madness and more about the horrible consequences of royal inbreeding, Charles II of Spain, who lived from 1661 to 1700, was called Charles the Bewitched. But he wasn't bewitched. He was the product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding, and his body and mind paid the price for his family's obsession with keeping the bloodline pure. The Spanish Habsburgs had a policy of marrying within the family to keep their vast territories united under Habsburg control. Uncle married niece. First cousins married each other for generations. This went on. And with each generation, the physical and mental problems got worse. By the time Charles was born, the family tree looked more like a family wreath, looping back on itself again and again. And Charles bore all the accumulated damage. His tongue was so large he could barely speak or eat properly. His jaw jutted out so far he couldn't close his mouth. A feature so pronounced it's still called the Habsburg jaw. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. He couldn't speak clearly until he was 10. He had constant digestive problems. He was short, weak, and sickly. Mentally, he never progressed beyond childhood. He had the mind of a boy in the body of a deteriorating man. And this person was King of Spain. Charles couldn't rule. He didn't understand what ruling meant. He liked simple things, playing with clocks, watching court dwarfs stage mock battles. He was kind and gentle. By all accounts, a sweet person, but he was completely incapable of being king. So others ruled for him, advisors, regents, royal favorites called validos. Spain's government became a series of factions fighting for control over the helpless king. The empire that had once been the most powerful in Europe declined rapidly under Charles's reign. The saddest part, Charles knew he was inadequate. Once, when a French diplomat praised the Escorial Palace, Charles replied, "It is not a palace that belongs to a king. It is a palace that belongs to God, and which is inhabited by a poor fool like me." Imagine knowing you're not capable of your job, but being trapped in it anyway. Born to power, but unable to wield it. Knowing everyone sees you as insufficient, but unable to change or escape. That was Charles's life. 39 years of being a king who wasn't really a king. When Charles died childless in 1700, his death sparked a massive war. Multiple countries claimed the Spanish throne, leading to the War of Spanish Succession. Europe fought for years over who would rule Spain now that the Habsburg line had ended. Charles's autopsy revealed the extent of the damage inbreeding had caused. His body was a catalogue of deformities and malfunctions. The report is disturbing to read even today. This is what happened when royal families valued pure bloodlines over healthy heirs. Your breathing becomes slower and deeper now as you think about Charles. Unlike the mad kings we've met, Charles didn't become terrible through mental illness. He was terrible because he never should have been born at all, or at least not with the genetic damage his family's inbreeding caused. He was kind. He meant no harm, but his mere existence showed the dangers of royal inbreeding, his suffering, and Spain's decline under his reign proved that bloodline purity came at too high a cost. Think about all these terrible kings together. Charles VI and his glass delusions, Henry VI and his catatonic episodes, Eric XIV and his paranoid murders, Ivan the Terrible and his reign of terror, Rudolph II thinking he was made of crystal, Justin II biting people and refusing to sit, Charles II too damaged by inbreeding to function. 7 kings, 7 different kinds of terrible, 7 kingdoms that suffered because the man wearing the crown couldn't handle it. Settling into the deepest rest now, you can see the common thread. Power concentrated in one person is dangerous when that person is flawed. And all people are flawed. These kings just happen to have flaws that made them particularly unsuited for absolute authority. Mental illness, paranoia, physical disability, genetic damage, each made ruling difficult or impossible. But they ruled anyway, because that's how monarchy works. You're born to power. You can't give it back. You're stuck with it whether you can handle it or not. As you drift towards sleep, let these stories remind you why modern democracies try to prevent power from concentrating too much in one person, why we have checks and balances, term limits, systems to remove leaders who aren't functioning. The terrible kings of medieval times show us what happens without those protections. When one person's madness or incompetence can't be challenged or contained, when there's no way to remove a failing king except death or coup, when everyone suffers because one person at the top is broken. Tonight, you rest knowing that the age of absolute monarchy is mostly past, that systems exist to prevent one person's madness from becoming everyone's nightmare. It's not perfect, but it's better than the medieval world where mad kings could rule for decades, their kingdoms bleeding while they raged or cowered or sat confused on thrones they couldn't properly fill. The terrible kings are gone. Their kingdoms are dust. But the lessons remain, and you carry those lessons into sleep, grateful for the progress that came after their failures. As we continue our journey through the dark halls of medieval monarchy, it's worth pausing to understand why so many kings went mad or proved terrible at their jobs. The position of king in the Middle Ages was uniquely suited to breaking people. Let's think about what it meant to be a medieval monarch and why the role itself might have been part of the problem. This understanding will help us appreciate why so many intelligent, capable people failed so spectacularly when given absolute power. First, consider the age at which many became king. Charles VI was 11. Henry VI was 9 months old. Ivan the Terrible was 3 when his father died, 8 when his mother was murdered. These were children thrust into positions of ultimate authority before they could possibly understand what that meant. Imagine being a small child and being told you rule a kingdom, that everyone must obey you, that your word is law, that God himself chose you. How does a child's mind process that? How does it affect development? For some, like Henry, it created a gentle soul who never wanted power and never learned how to wield it effectively. For others, like Ivan, it created a monster who learned that power meant survival and used it with brutal efficiency. But in both cases, premature power warped normal development. These children never got to be children. They were kings first, people second. And that reversal of priorities damaged them in ways that echoed throughout their reigns. Now add to that the isolation of kingship. A king couldn't have normal friendships. Everyone wanted something from him. Every relationship was transactional. Every person who approached him had an agenda. There was no one a king could truly trust. No one he could be vulnerable with. No one he could admit weakness to. Even family members might be plotting to take the throne. Brothers became rivals. Uncles became threats. Sons grew into potential usurpers. The paranoia we saw in Eric and Ivan wasn't entirely unjustified. Royal courts really were full of people plotting and scheming. Think about what that does to a mind over years or decades. Never able to relax. Never able to trust. Always wondering if the person smiling at you is planning your death. Always calculating who benefits from what decision. Always watching for betrayal. It's exhausting. It's corrosive. It creates exactly the kind of paranoia we saw in so many terrible kings. They weren't necessarily wrong to be paranoid. The world around them really was dangerous. But the constant vigilance required warped their minds until they couldn't distinguish real threats from imagined ones. Then There's the pressure of expectation. A king was expected to be a military commander, even if he had no talent for war, a wise judge, even if he didn't understand law, a political mastermind, even if he was simple-minded, a symbol of divine authority, even if he didn't believe in God. The role demanded perfection in a dozen different areas, and few people excel at everything. When kings failed at one aspect of their role, the entire kingdom suffered, but they couldn't admit failure or step down. They had to keep pretending to be capable even as everything collapsed around them. Charles II of Spain is a perfect example. He knew he wasn't smart enough to rule. He openly admitted it. But he couldn't resign. There was no mechanism for a king to say, I can't do this job. Find someone who can. He was trapped in a role he couldn't fill, forced to watch others manipulate him while his kingdom declined. The system had no escape hatch for inadequate kings. They ruled until they died, no matter how badly they ruled. Add to all this the physical demands of medieval life. Kings were expected to lead armies into battle, to ride horses for hours, to feast and drink with nobles, to father heirs. But what if you were weak or sickly like Charles? What if you had some physical condition that made these demands impossible? You still had to try. You still had to pretend. And the strain of pretending to be physically capable when you weren't added another layer of stress that could break a mind. Your breathing deepens naturally as you think about the psychological pressure cooker that was medieval kingship. Every factor designed to create maximum stress. Child rulers who never developed normally. Isolation that prevented normal human bonding. Paranoia justified by real danger. Expectations impossible to meet. Physical demands difficult to fulfill. Add mental illness to this mix, and you get the terrible kings we've discussed. Their madness didn't develop in a vacuum. The role itself was part of what broke them. Now consider the medical understanding of the time. Mental illness was seen as demonic possession, divine punishment, or weak character. There was no concept of brain chemistry, trauma response, or psychological treatment. When Charles VI started acting strange after the burning bull, no one thought, he's suffering from post-traumatic stress. They thought he was cursed or possessed. When Henry VI fell into a catatonic state, doctors tried bleeding him and giving him herbs. They had no understanding of what we'd now recognize as a severe mental breakdown. This meant that kings suffering mental illness got worse, not better. Instead of treatment, they got exorcisms. Instead of therapy, they got more isolation. Instead of medication, they got prayer and punishment. The very attempts to help them often made things worse. Ivan's violence was sometimes encouraged as holy wrath against enemies of God. Rudolph's reclusiveness was enabled because court found it easier to leave him alone. The system had no tools to help mad kings recover. Think about what this meant for the kings themselves. They were suffering, often aware that something was wrong with their minds, but unable to get help. Charles VI had lucid moments where he understood he'd been mad and was horrified. Henry VI knew something was wrong with him. These weren't monsters without insight. They were people trapped in malfunctioning minds, aware of their condition but helpless to fix it. That's its own special kind of hell. To know you're going mad, to feel your mind slipping, to watch yourself do terrible things and be unable to stop. That's torture, settling deeper into rest. Consider also the genetic factors we saw with Charles II. Royal families married each other to keep power concentrated and bloodlines pure. but inbreeding causes genetic problems. Each generation, the damage accumulated. Physical deformities, mental disabilities, health problems. The very system designed to keep royalty special was actually degrading them genetically. But they didn't know that. They thought pure bloodlines made them superior, when actually it was making them weaker. How many other kings suffered from inbreeding damage we don't recognize because it wasn't as obvious as Charles's deformities? How many cases of madness or incompetence were actually genetic disorders caused by too many generations of cousin marriage? We'll never know. But it's worth considering that some terrible kings might have been terrible because centuries of inbreeding had damaged their brains before they were even born. Not their fault. Not even really preventable, given medieval understanding. Just tragic. Now think about the lack of accountability. A king could be completely incompetent or actively harmful, and there was usually no way to remove him short of assassination or civil war. He could bankrupt his kingdom through poor decisions, lead armies to disaster through incompetent command, create enemies through diplomatic blunders, and he'd still be king. The system had no mechanism for peaceful removal of a failing monarch, so kingdoms were stuck with whoever was born first, regardless of ability. This created a situation where nations rose or fell based on genetic lottery. A capable king meant prosperity. An incompetent king meant decline. A mad king meant catastrophe. But it was all random. No one could predict or control who would be good at the job. The system just hoped each generation would produce at least one capable heir. When it didn't, as with Charles II being the only surviving heir of his generation, disaster followed. Compare this to leaders today. We have elections to choose leaders. We have term limits to remove them regularly. We have impeachment processes for leaders who fail. We have free press to expose incompetence. We have opposition parties to challenge bad decisions. None of these existed for medieval kings. They ruled until death, and no one could challenge them, no matter how badly they ruled. The terrible kings we've met tonight show exactly why that was a bad system. Your muscles relax completely now as you appreciate how far we've come in political organization. We've learned from the terrible kings. We've built systems to prevent one person from having absolute power, to remove failing leaders, to share power among many people, so one person's madness can't destroy everything. It's not perfect, but it's so much better than the medieval system where you were stuck with whoever was born to the throne. Competent or not, sane or not, capable or not. Think about the millions of people who lived under these terrible kings. Peasants who had no say in who ruled them. Merchants whose businesses suffered from bad royal decisions. Soldiers who died in wars their mad kings started. Nobles who had to navigate the dangerous waters of courts ruled by paranoid or insane monarchs. All of them powerless to change their situation. All of them at the mercy of one person's mental state. Their lives, their safety, their futures depending on whether their king happened to be sane. That's why these stories matter. Not just as interesting historical tales, but as reminders of why we built better systems. The terrible kings of medieval times taught humanity hard lessons about concentrated power, about the dangers of hereditary rule, about the need for checks and balances. Every democracy today exists partly because people remembered kings like Ivan and Charles and Henry and said, never again. Never should one person have such power. Never should an entire nation depend on one mind staying sane. As you drift toward deeper sleep, let yourself feel grateful for those lessons learned. grateful for systems that prevent terrible kings from arising, grateful for mechanisms that remove failing leaders, grateful for the understanding that power should be distributed, limited, are checked. The terrible kings broke so that future generations could build something better. Their madness taught us sanity. Their cruelty taught us mercy. Their failures taught us how to succeed. Tonight, you rest in a world built on the ruins of absolute monarchy, a world that learned from medieval mistakes, a world where terrible kings are rare because we've built protections against them. The ghosts of Charles, Henry, Erich, Ivan, Rudolph, Justin, and the last Charles haunt history as warnings. Their suffering, and the suffering they caused, serves a purpose. It reminds us why we must never return to that system, why power must be shared, limited, checked, why no one person should hold a nation's fate in their hands. The terrible kings are gone. Their kingdoms are dust. Their absolute power is a memory, but the world they helped create through their failures is better, more just, more sane, more human. And that's worth remembering as you drift off to sleep, that even terrible things can teach valuable lessons, that even the darkest chapters of history can illuminate the path forward, that the price paid by those who lived under mad kings purchased wisdom for all the generations that followed. As we near the end of our journey through the dark corridors of medieval monarchy, let's reflect on what these stories of terrible kings tell us about power, humanity, and the progress we've made. These weren't just individual tragedies. They were systemic failures that taught humanity crucial lessons about how not to organize society. Every terrible king is a chapter in the book of human political evolution, showing us what doesn't work and pointing us toward what might. Consider the sheer randomness of the hereditary system. The future of entire nations depended on who happened to be born first to the current king. No consideration of ability, no testing of character, no evaluation of mental stability, just birth order. If the eldest son was a genius, the kingdom prospered. If he was mentally ill, the kingdom suffered. It was government by genetic lottery, and the odds were terrible. Think about how insane that is when you really consider it. Imagine if we selected other important positions this way. If the first baby born in a hospital became that hospital's director 30 years later, if the oldest child in a town automatically became mayor, if captains of ships were chosen by whose parents previously captained ships, we'd recognize immediately how ridiculous that is. Yet for most of human history, that's exactly how we chose the most important position in society. The person with absolute power over millions was selected by accident of birth. No wonder so many were terrible at the job. The kings we've met tonight show the consequences of this system. Charles VI, traumatized by the burning ball, had no business ruling but couldn't step down. Henry VI, too gentle for the brutal world of politics, was forced into a role he couldn't fulfill. Ivan the Terrible, damaged by childhood abuse, wielded absolute power with no restraints. None of them chose to be king. They were born to it, and both they and their subjects paid the price. Now think about the isolation that came with absolute power. A king couldn't admit weakness or ask for help without appearing vulnerable. He couldn't confide in advisors because they all had agendas. He couldn't trust friends because friendship with the king was never just friendship. Even family members were potential threats. This isolation is part of what drove so many kings mad. Humans are social creatures. We need connection, trust, vulnerability. Deny those needs long enough, and the mind breaks. Eric XIV's paranoia makes more sense when you understand this isolation. He really was surrounded by people who wanted to use or replace him. His brother really did eventually overthrow him. The nobles really were plotting. So when his mind started seeing conspiracies everywhere, reality and delusion blurred together. He couldn't distinguish real threats from imagined ones because, in his position, almost everything was a potential threat. The isolation of power made accurate perception impossible. Rudolph II withdrew into his collections partly because objects were safer than people. A rare book won't betray you. An exotic animal won't plot against you. A mechanical marvel won't try to steal your throne. His glass delusion, believing he would shatter if touched, is almost poetic. On some level, he knew that human contact in his position was dangerous, that letting people get close risked being broken. So his mind created a delusion that made isolation logical. If you're made of glass, of course you can't let people touch you. The metaphor became literal in his fractured mind. Your breathing becomes even slower now, even deeper. As you think about touch and connection, you can hug people who love you. You can shake hands with friends. You can embrace family without fearing betrayal. These simple acts of human connection were denied to kings, or at least complicated by the political implications of every relationship. Imagine going years without a hug that didn't have ulterior motives, without a conversation that wasn't secretly a negotiation, without a touch that was just human warmth without calculation, settling deeper into rest. Consider what this says about human needs. We need connection more than we need power. The terrible kings were rich beyond measure, commanded armies, lived in palaces, but they were often profoundly lonely, unable to trust, unable to be vulnerable, unable to be truly seen and known. And that loneliness contributed to their madness. Power isolated them. Isolation broke them. Being broken made them terrible rulers. And terrible rulers meant suffering for millions. A cascade of tragedy starting from one simple problem: absolute power prevents human connection. Now let's think about the children of these terrible kings. The sons and daughters who grew up watching their fathers descend into madness or cruelty. Charles VI's children saw their father howl like a wolf and insist he was made of glass. Henry VI's son watched his father drift in and out of catatonic states. Ivan the Terrible's son died by his father's hand. These children were traumatized by their father's madness, then often forced to rule kingdoms their fathers had damaged. Generational trauma in royal families was intense. A mad king damaged his children psychologically. Those damaged children often became the next generation of rulers, bringing their trauma to the throne. Sometimes this created a cycle where madness or cruelty passed from father to son, not through genetics alone, but through the psychological damage of growing up in a dysfunctional royal household. Break the father, damage the son, repeat for generations. Only death or revolution could break the cycle. Think about the women in these stories, the wives of mad kings who watched their husbands transform into strangers. Corinne, who stayed with Eric XIV through his madness and imprisonment, loving him even when his mind was gone. Queen Isabeau, married to Charles VI, trying to manage France while her husband insisted he was made of glass. Empress Sophia, effectively ruling the Byzantine Empire while her husband bit people and refused to sit down These women showed courage and capability, often holding kingdoms together while getting no credit because women couldn't officially rule. How different would history be if these capable women had been allowed to rule openly, if Sophia could have officially taken the Byzantine throne when Justin went mad, if Isabeau could have been recognized as regent over France instead of having to work through proxies, if Karin's loyalty and steadiness had been harnessed to help govern Sweden. The medieval system wasted female capability, insisting that mad or incompetent men must rule, while capable women could only influence from the shadows. Your muscles relax completely now as you appreciate how society has evolved to recognize women's capability, how we no longer insist that rule must pass to the eldest son regardless of ability, how we've learned that gender doesn't determine competence. The terrible king's wives often showed more wisdom and stability than their husbands, but the system wouldn't officially acknowledge it. We've corrected that injustice, at least partially. Progress built on the failures of the past. Now consider the religious dimension of medieval kingship. Kings were thought to be God's chosen, ruling by divine right. This made their madness or cruelty particularly disturbing. If God chose this mad king to rule, what did that say about God's judgment? If this cruel tyrant ruled by divine right, what did that say about divine values? The terrible kings created theological crises, challenging the very basis of medieval political and religious thought. Some people lost faith watching mad kings claim divine authority. Others developed elaborate explanations for why God would allow such rulers. Some concluded that madness was divine punishment on the kingdom for collective sin. Others decided that even mad kings must be obeyed, because questioning them meant questioning God. The terrible kings forced medieval people to wrestle with hard questions about divine authority, human suffering, and the nature of political legitimacy. These theological struggles eventually contributed to new political philosophies. If kings could be mad or cruel, maybe they didn't actually rule by divine right. Maybe legitimate authority came from somewhere else, from the people, from competence, from consent, from something other than birth. The Enlightenment ideas that eventually challenged monarchy grew partly from people looking at terrible kings and thinking, this can't be God's plan. There must be a better way. Think about how revolutionary that thought was. For centuries, monarchy had been seen as divinely ordained, the natural order of things. Kings ruled because God wanted them to. Questioning this meant questioning God, but the terrible kings made that question unavoidable. When the person claiming divine authority is raving about being made of glass or biting his servants, divine right theory becomes hard to maintain. The gap between claim and reality grows too large to ignore. As you drift toward deeper sleep, appreciate how far political thought has evolved. We no longer believe that any human rules by divine right. We understand that authority comes from consent, competence, and democratic legitimacy. No one rules just because they were born to it. No one's authority is unquestionable just because of their bloodline. We learned these lessons partly by watching terrible kings claim divine authority while demonstrating profound incompetence or madness. The terrible kings also taught lessons about accountability. Medieval monarchs had almost none. They could bankrupt kingdoms, lose wars, kill innocents, and face no consequences. There was no mechanism to peacefully remove a failing king. Revolution or assassination were often the only options. And both were bloody, so kingdoms suffered under terrible rulers for decades because removing them was too difficult and dangerous. Modern systems try to build in accountability. Elections mean leaders must face the judgment of voters. Term limits mean no one rules forever. Impeachment processes allow removal of failing leaders. These mechanisms exist because humanity learned from medieval kings who ruled terribly with no consequences. We built systems to prevent one person from being unremovable, regardless of how badly they perform. The terrible kings taught us that accountability isn't optional. It's essential for functional government. Think about the advisors trying to manage kingdoms ruled by mad kings. They had to navigate impossible situations, implement policies the king didn't understand or even know about, run wars the king couldn't command, make diplomatic decisions the king couldn't rationally evaluate, all while maintaining the fiction that the king was in charge. It was government by pretense, and it created its own problems. Who really ruled when the king was mad? The answer was often unclear, leading to power struggles that damaged the kingdom further. This situation created a strange dynamic where everyone knew the king couldn't rule, but everyone had to pretend he could. The emperor's new clothes, but with the fate of nations hanging in the balance. Honest acknowledgement of the king's incapacity would have been treasonous. But pretending he was capable led to disasters. So advisors walked a tightrope, trying to rule effectively while maintaining the fiction of royal authority. Many failed. The kingdom suffered, all because the system couldn't acknowledge reality. Your breathing is so slow now, so peaceful. As you think about transparency in modern governance, we can acknowledge when leaders are failing. We can have public discussions about their competence. We can remove them if necessary. This openness, this ability to face reality instead of maintaining convenient fictions, is progress built on medieval mistakes. The terrible kings showed what happens when reality can't be acknowledged. We learned to value truth over comfortable lies. As we prepare to conclude our journey through terrible kingship, reflect on how these stories connect. Different kings, different kingdoms, different forms of madness or inadequacy, but common threads running through all their stories. The isolation of power, the weight of expectations, the lack of accountability, the randomness of hereditary succession, the absence of help for mental illness, the waste of female capability, the theological contradictions, the necessity of maintaining fictions. All of these factors combined to create the terrible kings and the suffering they caused. These weren't just individual failures. They were systemic problems. The system of absolute hereditary monarchy created terrible kings, inevitably. Not every king was terrible, but enough were that the pattern is clear. When you select leaders by birth, give them absolute power, isolate them completely, provide no accountability, and offer no help for their personal struggles, you create conditions where terrible rulers emerge regularly. The medieval system practically guaranteed occasional disasters. Understanding this helps us appreciate modern political systems, not because they're perfect, they're not, but because they try to address the systemic problems that created terrible kings. Distributed power instead of absolute authority, democratic selection instead of hereditary succession, term limits instead of lifetime rule, accountability mechanisms instead of unquestionable authority, public discussion instead of courtly pretense. These aren't just theoretical improvements, they're practical solutions to problems illustrated by every terrible king we've met tonight. As you drift toward the edge of sleep, carry with you the knowledge that progress is real, that humanity learns from its mistakes, that the terrible kings weren't meaningless tragedies, but painful lessons that taught us how to build better systems. Their suffering, and the suffering they caused, purchased wisdom we still use today. Every democracy, every constitutional monarchy, every system of checks and balances exists, partly because people remembered terrible kings and said never again. That's their legacy. That's what they teach us across the centuries. And so we come to the end of our journey through the dark halls of medieval monarchy, where terrible kings ruled and kingdoms suffered. We've met Charles VI and his glass delusions, Henry VI and his catatonic stupors, Eric XIV and his paranoid murders, Ivan the Terrible and his reign of terror, Rudolph II and his crystal body, Justin II and his inability to sit, Charles II and his inbreeding damage. 7 terrible kings, 7 cautionary tales about power without limits. But as we prepare to let these stories fade into the realm of dreams, let's consider one final question. Were these truly terrible kings, or were they tragic figures trapped in a terrible system? The answer, as with most historical questions, is complicated. Both things can be true simultaneously. These men made choices that caused suffering, but they were also products of a system designed to break people. They were terrible, and they were tragic. The suffering they caused was real. The suffering they experienced was also real. Charles VI didn't choose to be traumatized by the burning ball. He didn't decide to lose his mind. The madness overtook him, and he fought it in his lucid moments, but couldn't stop it. Is a sick person terrible for being sick? Is someone whose mind breaks under strain a monster? Charles caused problems for France? Yes, but he was also a victim of illness in an age with no treatment. Both realities coexist. He was terrible and pitiable, a failed king and a suffering human. Henry VI didn't choose to be gentle in a brutal age. He didn't decide to have a mental breakdown. He was thrust onto a throne as an infant, raised to be something he couldn't be, and broke under pressures that might have broken anyone. His inadequacy cost England dearly, but he was also a kind man in an unkind position, trying his best in impossible circumstances. Is that terrible or tragic? Again, both. He failed and he suffered. England paid for his failure, and he paid for his gentleness. Eric XIV made real choices to commit murder. He ordered the execution of noble men. He created the conditions for his own overthrow through paranoia and cruelty. There's genuine moral failing there, genuine choices that caused suffering. But he was also mentally ill. His paranoia, fueled by real threats and distorted by a mind that couldn't process reality accurately. Do we condemn the mentally ill for their actions during episodes? Do we hold them fully accountable when their judgment was impaired? The questions are harder than they first appear. Ivan the Terrible presents perhaps the hardest case. His cruelty was extreme, deliberate, sustained over decades. He chose to create the oprichniki. He chose to massacre Novgorod. He chose violence again and again. The childhood trauma that shaped him doesn't erase those choices. Yet can we fully separate the man from the traumatized child? The abuse he suffered clearly created the monster he became. Both things true, he was responsible for his actions, and he was shaped by forces beyond his control. The line between explanation and excuse blurs uncomfortably. Your breathing becomes slower and deeper as you think about moral complexity, about how easy it is to judge historical figures and how much harder it is to understand them, about how someone can be both victim and victimizer, both tragic and terrible. The kings we've met tonight don't fit neatly into categories of good or evil. They're messy, complicated, human. And that's important to remember. It's easy to make them into cartoon villains. It's harder, but more honest, to see them as broken people whose brokenness had terrible consequences, settling into deeper rest. Consider what this means for how we think about leaders today. Every leader is human. Every human is flawed. Every flaw, under enough pressure, can become catastrophic. The difference between then and now isn't that modern leaders are better people. It's that modern systems try to contain the damage flawed leaders can cause. We limit power. We create accountability. We allow removal of failing leaders. We try to build systems that work, even when the people running them are imperfect. The terrible kings teach us that we can't rely on leaders being virtuous. We can't hope for saints to rule us. We have to assume leaders will be flawed, sometimes deeply flawed, and build systems that function anyway. Systems that don't collapse when one person fails. Systems that distribute power so no single person's madness can destroy everything. Systems that recognize and respond to failure instead of maintaining fictions. That's the wisdom extracted from centuries of terrible kings. Now think about the millions who lived under these rulers. Peasants farming land owned by mad kings. Merchants trying to conduct business in unstable kingdoms. Soldiers dying in wars started by paranoid monarchs. Children growing up in kingdoms torn by civil conflict. None of them had any say in who ruled them. None could escape. They were born into kingdoms, assigned to kings, forced to endure whatever came. Their lives, their futures, their very survival dependent on the mental stability of one person they never chose and couldn't remove. That was the medieval reality for most people. And it wasn't that long ago. Just a few centuries separate us from a world where your life depended on whether your king happened to be sane. We've made enormous progress in a relatively short time. Democratic systems, human rights, social mobility. These aren't ancient traditions. They're recent developments, revolutionary changes in how human societies organize themselves. We live in the aftermath of a political revolution that overthrew the entire system that created terrible kings. Your muscles relax completely now as you appreciate how recently things changed. Your great-great-great-grandparents might have lived under monarchies. The world we think of as normal, with elections and rights and accountability, is historically new. We're living in the experimental period where humanity tries something different after millennia of kings. And while our experiments aren't perfect, they're working better than the old system did. The terrible kings proved that the old way failed too often. We're still learning the new way, but we're learning. Think about what it means that you've never lived under a terrible king, that you've never watched your ruler descend into madness while being powerless to do anything, that you've never seen your country torn apart by civil war because of royal insanity, that you've never experienced the helpless terror of living under absolute authority, wielded by someone incompetent or cruel. These absences in your life represent enormous political progress. What you've never suffered is suffering your ancestors knew well. As you drift toward the edge of sleep, let gratitude wash over you. Gratitude for the experiments in democracy that freed humanity from terrible kings. Gratitude for the revolutions that overthrew absolute monarchy. Gratitude for the philosophers who imagined better systems. Gratitude for the activists who fought to implement them. Gratitude for the slow, painful progress that moved us from the world of terrible kings to the world you inhabit now. Progress built on the ruins of failed kingdoms and the graves of those who suffered under mad monarchs. The terrible kings are gone. Charles' France, Henry's England, Eric's Sweden, Ivan's Russia, all transformed beyond recognition. The absolute monarchies that created those terrible rulers have mostly vanished, replaced by systems designed to prevent such concentrated power. The age of terrible kings is over, at least in its medieval form. We learned, we changed, we built something better from the rubble they left behind. But don't let the historical distance create false comfort. The human tendencies that created terrible kings still exist. The desire for absolute power, the corrupting influence of authority, the way power isolates and warps judgment, the challenges of mental illness, the randomness of human capability, these haven't disappeared. They're still with us, waiting for the right conditions to re-emerge. The systems we've built to contain them only work if we maintain them, understand them, defend them. That's why these stories matter, not just as interesting historical tales to help you fall asleep, though they are that, but as reminders of what we're protecting against when we defend democracy, human rights, checks and balances, term limits. These aren't abstract principles. They're practical protections against the return of terrible kings. Every time we insist on accountability, we prevent another Ivan. Every time we limit power, we prevent another Charles. Every time we demand competence over bloodline, we prevent another Charles II. The ghosts of terrible kings haunt our political systems as warnings. They whisper from history, this is what happens when power isn't limited. This is what happens when leaders aren't accountable. This is what happens when mental illness goes untreated in positions of authority. This is what happens when systems can't remove failing leaders. Remember us. Learn from us. Don't repeat our mistakes. Don't let our suffering and the suffering we caused be meaningless. Build better. Do better. Be better. Your breathing is barely perceptible now. Slow and deep and peaceful, the terrible kings fade into the darkness where they belong. Their lessons learned, their warnings heeded. You rest in a world they helped create through their failures. A world that remembered them and said never again. A world that built protections against the very problems they embodied. A world where terrible kings are rare because we've learned how to prevent them, contain them, remove them when they emerge. Tonight, as you slip into sleep, let the stories of Charles, Henry, Eric, Ivan, Rudolph, Justin, and the last Charles settle into your memory, not as nightmares, but as teachers. They suffered, they caused suffering, they failed. They broke, they were terrible, and they were tragic. All of these things together, all of these truths held simultaneously. History is complicated. People are complicated. Power reveals and amplifies human flaws in ways that can be catastrophic. But we've learned, we've grown, we've built better systems, not perfect systems, but better ones than we had. The terrible kings taught us at enormous cost what doesn't work. Now we try to implement what does. The experiment continues. Democracy evolves. Rights expand. Accountability improves. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and struggles, humanity moves away from the age of terrible kings towards something better. Their darkness illuminates our path forward. Good night, gentle soul. Sleep well in a world the terrible kings helped create by showing us what to avoid. Dream peacefully, knowing that their reign of absolute authority has ended. Rest deeply understanding that the lessons they taught weren't wasted. As you drift into sleep, let go of their darkness. You've heard their stories. You've learned their lessons. Now let them return to history where they belong. No longer threats, but memories. No longer terrors, but teachers. No longer present dangers, but past warnings that still guide us. The medieval world was harsh and brutal, especially for those ruled by terrible kings. But we've emerged from that darkness into something brighter. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. Always trying to be better. The terrible kings showed us what worse looks like. Now we keep building toward better, and that's worth carrying into dreams. That's worth remembering as sleep takes you, that even the darkest chapters of history serve a purpose if we learn from them, if we let them teach us, if we honor the suffering they represent by refusing to repeat their mistakes. Sweet dreams, traveler through history. May you rest in the peace the terrible kings never knew. May you wake to possibilities they never imagined. May you live in the better world their failures helped create. Good night.